She was just a waitress in a small-town diner. He was a millionaire with a daughter who hadn't smiled in years. But one quiet moment changed everything. Sometimes, it only takes a single act of kindness to heal a broken world. Enjoy the story. The rain began as a whisper, light droplets tracing silver veins across the windshield of Gavin Carter's black SUV. He sat motionless behind the wheel, engine idling, eyes fixed on the warm glow of the diner across the street. Inside, through the steamy glass and soft yellow light, he saw them. Her and his daughter. A stranger in a flour-dusted apron knelt beside Lily's wheelchair. Not a doctor, not a therapist, just a waitress. Yet something about the way she held the spoon, the way she looked at Lily, not with pity, not with fear, but with calm, made Gavin forget how to breathe. He blinked once, then again, and that's when he saw it. Lily's hand moved, a small, uncertain twitch, and then her lips parted, just slightly. The spoon reached her mouth, and she drank. It was only a sip, barely a swallow, but it was more than any doctor had achieved in 2 years. And then, God help him, she smiled. His daughter, who hadn't smiled since the funeral, since the accident, since the silence. Gavin's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Water dripped from his hairline down to his collar as he stepped out into the rain. He crossed the street without thinking. Each footstep landed like thunder in his ears. This couldn't be real. The hostess barely noticed him as he entered, the bell above the door chiming softly, like it knew something sacred had happened inside. He stood frozen just a few steps in, not because he didn't know what to do, but because for the first time in years, he was afraid. Afraid to break whatever moment this was. Afraid to believe. Because Gavin Carter believed in numbers, in contracts, in facts and logic. He didn't believe in angels or hope. And yet there she was. Not his daughter. The woman beside her, speaking in hushed tones, her hand steady, her presence grounding. She hadn't noticed him yet. All her attention was on Lily, who sat impossibly still, her tiny fingers wrapped around the edge of the bowl like it held the sun. No crying, no screaming, just stillness. Peace. And Gavin felt it, like a wave, warm and terrifying. Was this what healing looked like? He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she had said or done, or how she had reached inside the fortress Lily had built around herself. But he knew this. Something had shifted. And for the first time since his world had fallen apart, Gavin Carter stepped forward not as a businessman, not as a millionaire, but as a father desperate to understand how a stranger had done what no one else could. He walked toward them, and the bell over the door whispered again, this time like a heartbeat returning to life. Gavin Carter didn't believe in second chances. He believed in results, in leverage, in calculated risks, in doing what had to be done, no matter the cost. At 38, he had a face the media loved, clean-cut, sharp-jawed, always composed. The magazines called him a visionary. The headlines praised him for transforming Carter Holdings from a fading family firm into a global empire. Private jets, marble boardrooms, impossible deals. That was his world. But no headline ever mentioned Lily, his daughter, the one thing he couldn't fix. She had been 6 when it happened. A car crash, sudden, unforgiving. One moment she had been humming along to a lullaby in the back seat. The next, silence. His wife gone. Lily broken in ways no surgeon could repair. Now, 2 years later, she sat in silence most days, her small frame swallowed by a wheelchair, her voice buried somewhere deeper than any diagnosis could explain. She didn't speak. She barely ate. She didn't respond to toys, to books, to specialists flown in from every corner of the country. And Gavin, who had built skyscrapers from blueprints and resurrected dying corporations with a signature, could only sit across from her at breakfast, quietly begging her to blink, to reach, to come back. He had hired the best, fired the ones who failed, rebuilt his mansion to accommodate ramps, rails, nurses, and yet, every night, he walked past Lily's room with dread in his chest. Because there were no deals to be made with grief. There was no bargaining with guilt. Not when it whispered that he should have been in the car that night. Not his wife, not her. And so Gavin did what men like him always did when the world made no sense. He retreated into control. He measured Lily's progress in charts, scheduled appointments with military precision. He read medical journals long past midnight, pored over every scrap of literature on trauma-induced mutism and neuroplasticity. But deep down, he knew. He wasn't doing it for answers. He was doing it because silence was easier than admitting he didn't know how to love her as she was now. Until that night at the diner. Until the girl with the flower-streaked sleeve knelt beside Lily and did something no specialist had managed in 2 years. She made Lily sip. She made her smile. And something cracked. Not in Lily, in him. He couldn't stop thinking about it. About her. Who was she? Why did Lily respond to her? What had she said that no one else thought to say? He didn't sleep that night. Not really. He sat in his study surrounded by leather-bound contracts and photos of people he used to call friends, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, and a storm in his chest. By morning he had made up his mind. He needed to find the waitress, not to thank her, to understand. Because if there was even a sliver of a chance that she could help his daughter, then Gavin Carter would move heaven and earth to bring her into their lives. He didn't care what it cost. Not this time. This wasn't business. This was Lily. And this time, he wasn't willing to lose. The next evening, Gavin returned to the diner. This time, he didn't sit. He stood near the entrance, scanning every face. Then he saw her, behind the counter, wiping down a tray, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on her cheek. The waitress. She looked smaller than he remembered, not in presence, but in weariness. Her movements were fast but careful, like someone used to juggling too much for too long. He approached without thinking. She looked up, startled, then straightened. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice more guarded than before. "We need to talk," he replied. She glanced toward the kitchen. "I'm working. This won't take long." He didn't ask for permission. He motioned toward the side corridor that led past the restrooms, quiet, away from curious eyes. Reluctantly, she followed. Once there, Gavin turned to her, arms crossed, not in judgment, but in defense. Of what, he didn't yet know. "You were incredible with Lily," he said. She blinked. I treated her like a kid, not a case file." He studied her, noting the flicker of something behind her words, something buried, familiar. "You've worked with kids like her before." She stiffened. I used to babysit, she said, too quickly. Gavin tilted his head. You're lying. The silence that followed was sharp. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. But he had already made the call. His assistant had already pulled the records. Vanessa Lane, he said softly. Top of your class at NYU. Special education program. Professors called you a rising star. Her breath hitched. Then, 2 years ago, you disappeared. Vanessa turned away, her shoulders tensing. No diploma, no thesis, no explanation. And now you're here, serving soup in a diner. Why does it matter? She whispered, her voice tight. Because you're the first person who's reached my daughter in 2 years. Her jaw trembled. I'm not who you think I am. Then tell me who you are. Vanessa turned back to him, eyes burning. Why? So you can offer me a job? Write a check big enough to make me forget? I'm not offering money, Gavin said, his voice suddenly soft. I'm asking for something more dangerous. Vanessa blinked. What? Time. With Lily. As her caregiver. She recoiled. No. Gavin didn't flinch. She trusts you. She smiled at you. And that's exactly why I can't, Vanessa said, shaking her head. Because if I mess this up, if I fail again, the word hung there, thick and heavy. Gavin stepped closer. What happened, Vanessa? She didn't answer. Not yet. But her silence said enough. He let her go that night. Didn't push. Didn't demand. But something had been set in motion. A door cracked open. A past unearthed. A choice that would return in the days to come. And Gavin Carter, who once thought love was a risk he couldn't afford, was beginning to understand that some things were worth losing everything for, even if it meant confronting a pain neither of them were ready to name. The week that followed blurred into uncertainty. Vanessa hadn't given Gavin an answer. Not officially. But she hadn't said no again either. And so Gavin waited. He lingered longer than usual in the hallway outside Lily's room. Read the same bedtime story twice. Canceled 2 meetings, something his assistant hadn't seen him do in 5 years. And then, on the 6th evening, she showed up. No warning, no call, just a quiet knock at the door, sometime after sunset, when the house had fallen into its usual hush. She stood there in a gray hoodie and jeans, her hair damp from the rain, her eyes tired, but resolute. 1 week, she said. Gavin didn't smile, didn't react. He just stepped aside and let her in. Lily didn't acknowledge her at first. On the first day, she didn't even look up. Vanessa tried to read aloud. Books about animals, colors, flowers. But Lily stayed curled in her chair, staring past her like she wasn't there. On the second day, Vanessa brought finger paints. Lily turned her face away. On the third, she tried music, soft lullabies, the kind that used to calm her brother during his worst nights. Still, nothing. Gavin watched from a distance. In the beginning, it was just quiet observation, arms crossed, leaning in the doorway like a skeptic waiting for proof. But as the days passed, his posture softened, not because of some miraculous breakthrough, because of something subtler. Vanessa's persistence. She didn't push, didn't bribe, didn't flinch when silence stretched out for minutes at a time. She simply stayed. At dinner, she sat beside Lily even when the child refused to eat. She refolded blankets with care, She sang softly at night, knowing Lily might never respond. But she still showed up. And Gavin began to notice things. The way Vanessa spoke gently even when exhausted. The way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. The way she tucked a strand of Lily's hair behind her ear as if it were a ritual, sacred, unspoken. And the way Lily shifted. Not much, not enough for a headline, but small things. A flicker of her eyes when Vanessa entered the room. A twitch of her hand when the lullaby played. Once she even held the corner of Vanessa's shirt as she slept. Gavin saw it, felt it, but he also saw the shadows that followed Vanessa like old ghosts. One night, after Lily had fallen asleep, he found her in the kitchen, washing a mug that wasn't dirty. "You don't have to do that," he said gently. She didn't turn. "I know." "Why won't you tell me what happened?" Vanessa's hands froze under the faucet. The water ran over her fingers like glass. "Because telling you makes it real," she said quietly. He waited, but she didn't say more. That night, she left without another word. But the next morning, she was back. The tension built slowly between them, not from dislike, but from the growing awareness of each other. Gavin wasn't used to being questioned in his own home. Vanessa wasn't used to someone seeing her pain without trying to fix it. They clashed in the subtlest ways. Gavin tried to implement structure, schedules, therapy protocols, meal plans. Vanessa resisted. She followed instinct, not instruction. "You can't expect results without a system," he said once. "She's not a merger or a quarterly report," she shot back. He fell silent, because she was right. But that didn't make it easier. Vanessa, for all her patience with Lily, was guarded with him. She spoke in short sentences, answered questions with shrugs, deflected compliments with dry humor. And Gavin, for all his wealth and control, didn't know how to reach her. He knew numbers, not emotions, contracts, not confessions. But still, he tried. He brought her tea in the late hours, sat beside her during Lily's story time, asked about her favorite books, only to find she never finished them. "I don't like endings," she said simply. And one evening, while folding laundry, she asked quietly, "Do you ever get tired of pretending you're not scared?" Gavin had no answer, because no one had ever asked him that before. They were two people orbiting around the same small girl, drawn together by a child who said nothing, yet spoke volumes. And though neither admitted it aloud, something had begun. Not trust, not yet, but proximity. And the way proximity makes silence louder, looks longer, and hands linger just a little too long. The first wave had begun. Not in confrontation, but in the quiet ache of two lives slowly, painfully, colliding. It started with a book. Not a children's one, not a medical guide. Just a novel, soft cover, worn edges, something Vanessa had pulled from the shelf beside Lily's bed. She read it aloud on a quiet Thursday afternoon, her voice steady but gentle, never asking for attention, just offering it. Lily didn't react, not at first, but halfway through the second chapter, Vanessa noticed her fingers tapping, once, then again, a soft, uncertain rhythm. Vanessa's voice caught. "You like this story, don't you?" she whispered. Lily didn't answer, but the tapping continued. That night, Vanessa stayed later than usual. After tucking Lily in, she sat beside the bed, staring at the child who had taken so much from her grief, yet given something back, too. She thought of Caleb, of lullabies sung in hospital corridors, of promises made to a little boy she couldn't save. She hadn't sung since the funeral, but the room was still, the air fragile, and something inside her cracked. She opened her mouth. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Lily stirred. "You make me happy when skies are gray." Her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. Vanessa's voice trembled. "I never knew how much I missed singing," she whispered, brushing a strand of Lily's hair back. "Or how much I hated silence." Outside the room, Gavin stood frozen in the hallway. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He was just passing by. But the melody stopped him cold. It was more than a lullaby. It was confession in disguise, a quiet bridge between pain and forgiveness. He stayed there long after the last note faded, staring at the door like it held answers. Vanessa never mentioned it the next day, but Lily smiled during breakfast. Just a flicker, and it undid something in him. The days stretched into a rhythm, morning routines, therapy disguised as games, books shared like secrets, silences that no longer felt hollow. And with every passing hour, the house changed. Gavin noticed it in strange ways. The cold teacup left by the windowsill, forgotten in a moment of play. The scarf Vanessa always wore, now draped over the couch like she belonged. The scent of cinnamon lingering in the kitchen long after lunch. Little things. Soft things. Things the mansion had not held since his wife died. One afternoon, he passed by the guest room and saw Vanessa sitting on the floor, her back against the bed, fast asleep. Lily was asleep too, half on the rug, one hand clutching Vanessa's sleeve like it was the only thread tethering her to the world. And maybe it was. He didn't wake them. He just stood there, watching, wanting, and aching for something he hadn't dared admit. That night, while Vanessa made tea, Gavin spoke. "Why do you always bring that necklace?" She looked down, fingers grazing the thin chain around her neck. "It was Caleb's," she said. "He gave it to me for my 17th birthday. Said I needed something to remind me that I was more than what the world expected." Gavin nodded slowly. "You wear your grief well." Vanessa chuckled, bitter, soft. "No, I just never figured out how to take it off." Silence fell again. But this time it wasn't painful. It was permission. To not be okay. To feel without fixing. Later, as they walked Lily through a simple stretching routine, her body stiff and trembling, something happened. She reached for Gavin's hand. Not Vanessa's. His. Gavin froze. Lily's fingers were small, fragile, trembling, but they wrapped around his like trust. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He just knelt beside her and held on. And in that moment, everything changed. Vanessa watched, her heart full and breaking all at once, because for the first time, she saw it. Gavin wasn't trying to replace anyone. He was learning how to show up, not with money, not with plans, just with presence. And presence, she realized, was the rarest form of love. That night, Vanessa found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a photograph. Lily. Laughing. It had been taken that morning, mid-giggle, while she reached for Gavin's tie and tried to pull it loose. On the back of the photo, Gavin had written just 3 words. She chose us. Vanessa sat on the bed, her fingers trembling, eyes wet. She hadn't expected that. Not from him, and especially not from herself. Because in all the ways she had tried to keep her heart closed, something had found its way in. A child, a man, a family. Not by blood, but by choice. And that terrified her more than anything else. It happened on a Sunday evening, the kind of quiet, golden hour that made the whole house feel like it was holding its breath. Lily had fallen asleep early, her fingers still sticky from the peach slices she had insisted on feeding herself. Vanessa was folding laundry in the living room, quietly humming. And Gavin stood on the patio, staring at the horizon, the sunset bleeding gold and violet across the sky. He heard her before he saw her, the soft rhythm of her steps, the creak of the door. "You okay?" Vanessa asked, stepping beside him. He nodded, but didn't speak. She watched him for a moment, then followed his gaze. "You don't talk much about her," she said. He didn't have to ask who. "My wife was the one who kept everything together," Gavin said finally. "She made the house feel less sterile." Vanessa waited. "She was softer than me. Better. Lily got her light from her." Silence stretched. "I still hear her voice sometimes," he continued. "In the hallways. In the way Lily curls up when she's scared. In the lullabies you sing." Vanessa's breath hitched. Gavin turned toward her. "I thought I lost all of that the day she died." Vanessa swallowed, her voice barely audible. "Maybe some of it stayed. In Lily. In here." She pressed a hand gently to his chest. The gesture was light, barely there, but it sent a shockwave through him. He reached up, fingers brushing against hers, holding them in place. Their eyes met. And then, slowly, hesitantly, he leaned in. The kiss was soft, not desperate, not fiery, just real. Vanessa didn't pull away, for a second, and then she did, abruptly. "Gavin," she whispered, stepping back. "I can't." He blinked, confused. "Did I do something wrong?" She shook her head, voice shaking. "No, I did." "Vanessa, I shouldn't have let it happen," she said, her tone sharper now. "This was supposed to be about Lily." "It is." "No," she snapped, tears welling. "Don't say that." She turned, walking back inside. Gavin followed, but carefully, like one wrong word might collapse everything. "Talk to me," he said. She stopped in the hallway, facing the wall. "You don't get it," she said, quieter now. "I can't care like that again." "Because of your brother?" Her shoulders tensed. "I gave everything to Caleb," she said. "My time, my dreams, my heart. And I still lost him. I'm not asking you to forget him, but you're asking me to risk it," she said. "To fall into something that could vanish. Again." Gavin stepped closer. "Is that really what you believe? That love is just borrowed time?" "I believe," she whispered, "that I don't survive loss well." He didn't answer, because he knew that truth too well himself. Vanessa looked up at him, her eyes red but fierce. "You want me here because I helped Lily, because I filled a space your wife left behind. That's not true, isn't it?" she asked. "If I wasn't the first person who made Lily smile, would I still be here?" That smile saved me, Gavin said. But you're the reason it happened. Vanessa shook her head. You think you're asking me to stay, but what you're really asking is for me to risk losing everything all over again. And with that, she turned. She walked out of the room, out of the house, out of the fragile thing they were just beginning to build. And Gavin, he didn't stop her, because he didn't know how, because the only language he had ever learned was logic, and none of this made sense. The next morning, Lily refused to eat. She wouldn't reach for her toys. She didn't smile. And when Gavin tried to read her favorite story, she turned her face to the wall. Something in him cracked. He sat there, beside her, holding the book open with one hand and his heart in the other. And all he could think was, "Come back. Please, come back." The house felt different without her. Colder, not in temperature, but in presence. Gavin wandered from room to room like a man trying to read a book with missing pages. The curtains stayed half-drawn. The music in the morning, silent. Even the light through the windows seemed thinner. And Lily had gone quiet again. Not in the same way. Not the stone-silent, unreachable way from before. This silence was worse. A knowing silence. A grieving silence. She looked for Vanessa every morning, reached toward the door with small, trembling hands, cried at night when no one was near. And Gavin, who once believed every problem had a solution, now sat at the edge of her bed whispering words that held no power. He had thought he was protecting her, protecting Vanessa. But what he'd really done was let fear speak louder than love. On the third night after she left, Gavin found Lily curled up, quietly sobbing into her pillow. He sat beside her, pulled the blanket over her shoulder, and just stayed. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. Until finally, in a voice barely louder than the wind, she whispered, "Where's Vanessa?" Gavin's heart cracked. He looked down at his daughter, this small, brave, broken girl, and felt the weight of every decision he'd ever made press into his chest. He didn't answer, because nothing he could say would make it right. So he did the only thing that made sense. He took Lily in his arms, wrapped her coat around her, and drove. The diner was busy, but Gavin didn't care. He stepped inside with Lily in his arms, ignoring the stares. His daughter's small fingers were gripped tightly around his collar, her eyes searching every corner of the room. And then, there she was, Vanessa. Behind the counter, taking an order, her apron smudged, her face drawn with exhaustion. She looked thinner, paler, as if she hadn't slept since she walked away. She turned and froze. Their eyes met. For a moment, no one moved. Then Vanessa saw Lily, and her face collapsed. She dropped the notepad, rounded the counter, and fell to her knees in front of them. "Lily," she whispered. The little girl looked at her, blinking once, then twice, and finally, she reached out. One small hand, one trembling gesture. Vanessa gathered her into her arms like something precious had returned from the dead. Gavin stood still, his throat tight. Then, softly, he said the words he hadn't known how to say until now. I need you. Vanessa looked up, her eyes glassy. I don't just need you for Lily, he added. I need you for me. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Gavin continued. I was scared of needing someone again, of losing someone, but watching her fall back into silence, watching myself fall apart again. I can't. Vanessa held Lily tighter. I don't want to be rescued, she said quietly. I'm not here to rescue you, Gavin said. I'm here to ask you to come home. She didn't answer. Not right away. But she didn't let go of Lily either. And sometimes, silence speaks the loudest. Later that night, they sat on the living room floor. Vanessa, Lily, and Gavin. No grand speeches, no dramatic gestures, just tea, a blanket, a children's book open in Vanessa's lap. Gavin sat beside them, Lily nestled between them like the glue that had always been there, just waiting for the right hands to hold her. Vanessa read. Gavin listened. And Lily? She reached for the spoon beside her bowl and, slowly, with effort, fed herself one soft bite. A giggle followed, small, quiet, but whole. Vanessa let out a soft cry, one hand covering her mouth. Gavin reached for her free hand. She let him. And when Lily looked up at them, eyes shining, Gavin knew. This was no longer a healing experiment. This was a family. Not perfect, not easy, but real and worth fighting for. Always. They didn't plan it. There was no speech, no fanfare, no moment that screamed, "This is it." Just a quiet Thursday morning. The sun filtered through the curtains like melted gold. Lily sat at the kitchen table, her legs dangling, her fingers tracing small patterns on her spoon. Vanessa stood by the stove, humming softly. Gavin poured coffee in silence. The house was still, but it no longer felt empty. Then Lily spoke. Not a word. A sound. A laugh. Small. Startling. Pure. It burst from her like light cracking through clouds. Vanessa turned so fast she almost dropped the pan. Gavin froze mid-pour. Lily giggled again, pointing toward the cat as it leapt onto the windowsill. "Mr. Buttons," she whispered. 2 words. Her first in over 2 years. Vanessa dropped to her knees. Gavin knelt beside her. They didn't speak. Didn't dare. Lily looked at them and smiled, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. Gavin cupped her cheeks, eyes wide. "You spoke, sweetheart." Vanessa's hands trembled. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Lily nodded. Gavin felt his heart stutter. Not from fear, from awe. Because this was a miracle stitched from ordinary things, from bedtime stories, from soft lullabies, from patience and presence, from love. That evening, Gavin found Vanessa outside. She stood on the patio, barefoot, wrapped in a sweater, staring up at the stars. He stepped behind her, quiet. She didn't turn, but she knew. "I didn't think she'd ever speak again," she whispered. She did. Because of you. No, he said, slipping his arms gently around her waist. Because of us. Vanessa exhaled, leaning back into him. I was so scared, she said, of failing again, of losing something I loved. I know, he replied. So was I. She turned then, and he saw it. The truth in her eyes, the surrender, the choosing. And before he could say another word, she kissed him. Not carefully this time, not with fear, but with every moment they had survived to get here. When they pulled apart, Gavin reached into his pocket, a small velvet box. Vanessa froze. Gavin. He opened it slowly. Inside, a simple silver ring. No diamonds. No extravagance, just something honest. I love you, he said. Vanessa blinked, tears already gathering. I don't just want you in Lily's life, he continued. I want you in mine. She laughed through a sob. You're insane. He nodded. Probably. Then he knelt and held her gaze. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking for a life, with you in it. Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Vanessa turned to her, then back to Gavin. And finally, she whispered, Yes. Gavin stood and slid the ring onto her finger. Vanessa pulled him into a kiss, and Lily clapped her hands, unaware of the gravity of what she had just witnessed. But maybe, understanding more than anyone. Later that night, the three of them curled on the couch, wrapped in one big blanket, the TV playing softly, a forgotten cup of cocoa growing cold nearby. Lily rested her head on Vanessa's shoulder. Gavin's arm stretched around both of them. The world outside kept spinning, but inside that room, time slowed, healed, settled. Because sometimes the loudest miracles come not in thunder, but in the sound of a child's laugh, a woman saying yes, and a man choosing love over everything he once thought kept him safe. Spring came quietly. No announcement, no trumpet of change, just the slow unfurling of leaves, the return of birdsong in the early morning, and sunlight that stretched longer each day across the wooden floors of the Carter estate. Vanessa opened the windows more now. She let the breeze in, let laughter echo through the halls again. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. Lily had begun to talk more. Just a few words at first, mostly names, colors, sounds. But every syllable was a victory, a tiny rebellion against the silence that once owned her. Sometimes Gavin would stop mid-task, mid-conference call, just to listen, to hear her say, Daddy, to hear her giggle when Vanessa tickled her ribs, to see her fall asleep with a book resting on her chest and a whisper of a smile on her lips. There were still hard days, days when Lily didn't want to eat, when the weight of memory pulled heavy on Vanessa's shoulders, when Gavin woke at 3 a.m., heart pounding with the echo of dreams he didn't understand. But now those moments were not endured alone. They were shared, held, softened by presence. One afternoon, Vanessa found an old envelope tucked behind Lily's bookshelf. It had been addressed in his late wife's handwriting. Inside was a photo. Lily at 3, covered in paint. Her mother beside her, mid-laugh, a brush in hand. On the back were 3 words. She needs softness. Vanessa stared at it for a long time, then slid it into the frame on Lily's dresser. She never spoke about it aloud, but Gavin noticed and said nothing. Because some things don't need words. One Saturday morning, Lily stood in the garden, alone. Her balance still shaky, her legs still uncertain, but she stood. Vanessa watched from the porch, tears in her throat. Gavin joined her, sliding his hand into hers. "She's stronger than we ever gave her credit for," Vanessa whispered. "She gets it from you." Vanessa turned to him, but he kept his gaze on Lily. "She gets her light from you," he added. Vanessa leaned her head against his shoulder. "And from her mother." Silence fell between them, warm, not cold, and in that stillness, something settled. Not a conclusion, but a beginning. They married on a quiet evening in the garden. No crowd, no cameras. Just Lily, holding a bouquet made of paper flowers she had cut and colored herself. A soft song playing in the background, and vows that were less about promises and more about presence. "I choose you," Gavin said, "on the days when I'm brave and on the days when I'm not." Vanessa's voice trembled. "I choose us, even when I'm scared." And Lily? She clapped when they kissed, then ran to them, her steps unsure, but her joy undeniable. They held her between them, and for a moment it felt like the world stood still. Later that night, as the stars blinked overhead and the wind brushed through the trees, Gavin carried Lily to bed. She was half asleep, murmuring something about a dream where the cat could fly. He tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and lingered for a moment longer than usual. Then he found Vanessa waiting in the hallway. She reached for his hand. He took it. No words, just warmth. Because they both knew, sometimes families are born from pain, but the ones who survive, they are written in love, in laughter after silence, in second chances, in the softest kind of strength, and in one child's voice, finally free. If this story touched your heart, leave I in the comments. And remember, real families aren't always made by blood. Sometimes they're made by grace.